hear you.
Okay, excellent. Thanks everybody for the attention. I have to begin maybe with a disclaimer that I am not an expert on agricultural research, and I'm not an expert on um, information of scientific information in developing countries. We just did this research on rice, so trying to see what was the research that was carried out throughout the world on rice. And my colleague, Tommaso Charli, who is based at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex, being a creative type of researcher, he did not agree with the initial proposal to use the conventional databases. This is the Web of Science database, but he thought that we should use CABI instead. And what we found out was that there was a very serious twofold, threefold disagreement or the disagreement between the numbers that we were getting when we're looking at CABI and when we're looking at Web of Science. For those of you working on agriculture in developing countries, I assume this is not a surprise at all. This had been reported in the literature in the 80s or 90s, particularly people like Grigas Arvanitis, who is in France in the IRD, the organization called IRD, had reported this. But we think that this is one of the first large-scale studies showing the amount of disagreement. So I'll try to be quick in the presentation. So let me start. In the face of an increasing demand for research management, information about the research that is carried out is handy. And from this information, you come up with indicators about the research which is produced throughout the world, and also some notions about how excellent, how many citations this research gets. Now, this is liked by managers because it helps reduce time and costs of the analysis. It increases the transparency and sense of objectivity and makes decisions somewhat easier to do. Now, the problem with this is that we are not sure whether using this information, which is now becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, is actually leading to better decisions. And this is because that there is an evaluation that with Paul Wouters, the director of CWTS, who's one of the Centrometrics leading laboratories at the University of Leiden. He calls this discrepancy between evaluation criteria, which are behind the bibliometric indicators, and the social and economic functions of science. In the case that concerns us, let's say rice research or agricultural research in general, there's this problem that locally relevant research is often invisible. And let's say the argument is that local knowledge on rice, on maize, is important for supporting local communities in a specific context. And also for the global challenges of science, which could be like food supply across the world, understanding the local conditions of production in every specific context is actually important to understand the aggregate result. And the same goes for climate change. So local research is important both for the global challenges and for supporting the local communities. However, there's this view that it can be marginalized, made invisible by the conventional databases. Another question would be, to which extent there is this invisibilization of local research? So here we have this scheme in which we have these three areas. Let's say we have a space of potential problems that science might tackle. In fact, and this is in this salmon color or sort of orange color. Then we have another space of the research which is actually done. And finally, there is a space of the research which is captured by the databases or by the indicators. And the idea is that the research that is well illuminated by the indicators is in the core, and then there is this other area which we might call the peripheries. And in this we mean geographical peripheries, social peripheries, disciplinary peripheries, which is not covered by the indicators. The problem being that what is not captured by the indicators might disappear. So when you end up processing information, you might believe that what is captured by the databases is the same as the space of problems and the space of research, but actually the space of problems and the space of research is much wider. So we've got here a potential problem. We know, it's been known for a long time that there might be biases in the databases. So, for example, the Web of Science is known to be heavily biased towards English and biomedical publications. Scopus has a much broader coverage, but surprisingly, research by Eric Archambault and colleagues in 2009 found that the rankings that you obtain in terms of publications using Scopus are somewhat similar. So if you look at the international benchmarking exercises that is carried out by the major international organizations, for example, the UNESCO carries out these global, I don't know how they call it, something like global science map or global science report, or studies carried out by the Royal Society looking at international science, you end up seeing that they're using the conventional databases. Now, we know that there is a bias. The question is, what is the extent of this bias? And in this case, what we did is we took all the research on rice for the Web of Science, the Scopus, CAP abstracts, and CAP abstracts, this is the Commonwealth Agricultural Bureau database. And we see that CAP abstracts has a much broader coverage, about twice as many publications. The question is, how does this affect the representation of knowledge in terms of who publishes and what type of research is carried out? So what we found out was that there is a massive difference in terms of the geographical coverage. You can see here, vertical axis is the share of publications in rice in the three databases, whereas the US represents about 15% of all publications in rice, according to Scopus and the Web of Science. According to CABI, the US only is around 7% of the total number of publications. In the case of Japan, there isn't such a big difference. But for the case of India and China, the results are the inverse of those of the US. So whereas Web of Science or Scopus would tell you that only 8-9% of the publications on rice are produced in India, CABI will tell you that actually more than 20% of the publications on rice are produced in India. And there's a difference as well in the case of China. If we look to other countries, the same type of pattern is found. So on the right-hand side here, you can see that developing countries, Italy, France, Australia, Germany, the UK, are overrepresented in Scopus and Web of Science. East Asian countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines are somewhat equally represented in the three databases, and countries such as Brazil, Pakistan, Iran, Egypt Sri Lanka are seriously underrepresented in the main databases. It is not a big surprise that it is well known that developing countries were underrepresented. We were surprised of the extent of this underrepresentation, which is more than 50% in many countries. Now, the second issue is about the topics which are underrepresented. So, and this is difficult to do because when you have a database, each database has a given disciplinary classification. So what we did is we pulled all the publications of the three databases together using the words of the abstract and the title. We clustered them by topic, and we ended up with these 7 topics, which are here: molecular biology in blue, traditional genetics in yellow, plant characteristics in pink, productivity, plant nutrition in green, consumption and human nutrition in red, and disease and pest and plant protection in this light blue. The question is, what is the coverage of the different databases of these different topics? What we find is that well, this would be the density now of publications in the different databases, sorry, with all the databases. So there's a lot of publications here on molecular biology, nutrition, and productivity, yield. If we look at a database such as PABI, we see more or less a similar knowledge landscape. And if we then look at Scopus, we see that there is a significant difference. That issues such as, here, allele marker, which is related to traditional genetics, or yield or plant, so productivity here, are underrepresented. So let's do the comparison again. So I'm moving back to CABI. You see, field experiments, fertilizers, which are related to productivity. If we move to Scopus, are much less covered. So when we put this into numbers, see you have in the vertical axis here, the coverage, so percentage of publications in a given database. And you have here the different topics. So if we take a topic such as molecular biology, the third in the center, you see that CABI has about 80% coverage of all the publications in this topic. Scopus has around 75%, and Web of Science a bit less than 60%. So conventional databases, Web of Science and Scopus, have a quite good, well, relatively good coverage. Now, if we move to a topic such as plant characteristics, the coverage of the conventional databases is much lower. Whereas CABI has a coverage of about 90%, Scopus has a coverage of 30%, and Web of Science of only 20%. Now, if you look at the different topics which are more or less well covered by Scopus and Web of Science, we see that they are molecular biology and consumption and human nutrition. Consumption and human nutrition, it's related to sports. So, for example, Thailand has a lot of publications in this area because it's a country which exports a lot of rice. So these are areas of interest to maybe high and middle income countries, whereas topics which are of the most interest of the least developed countries, such as plant characteristics, or here productivity and plant nutrition, are those which are much less well covered by Scopus and the Web of Science and the Web of Science. So what this is telling us is that there is not only a bias in the countries, but perhaps more worryingly, in terms of getting an understanding of the landscape of knowledge for a given topic, is there is a strong bias for the research topics. So let's see, if we have all the databases, you see that different countries, this is price research in all these different countries, different countries focus on different topics. Now, for countries such as the US, which focus on molecular biology here and food consumption here, the coverage of Web of Science is not so problematic. But for countries such as India, which have a lot of publications in the area related to plant nutrition, this is in order to increase productivity, there is a much stronger bias against. So, for example, here you see the knowledge representation of China. The left-hand side top for all the databases, here only for CABI. You get a somewhat similar picture. You see for Scopus, you get less coverage of the area related to traditional genetics and related to plant nutrition. And in the Web of Science, this underrepresentation is much stronger. For countries such as Cuba, which have really low coverage in the Web of Science, basically the research landscape that you find using the Web of Science or Scopus is extremely problematic. So in conclusion, what we find out is, well, first we confirm that there is a strong bias against developing countries, and this is, so it's not like 10, 20%, even 30%. The bias might be twofold. So this means that publications in, let's say, UNESCO that are based on Web of Science's Scopus data are questionable, at least. And this explains why that new databases such as Cielo in South America, Redelic in Latin America, or Agris, CABI are important. Also, somewhat more surprisingly, we see that the bias in coverage has a strong effect as well in the topics which are covered. So high coverage appears to be related to those areas which are of interest to developed countries, and there is much lower coverage in the conventional databases in topics that might be related to small farmers, local context, and with this potential exception of nutrition, which we need actually to pinpoint what type of nutrition is well covered. The policy implications are that there seems to be a need to complement mainstream analysis with other databases, and this might mean using databases such as Agris, CABI, Cielo, Redelic, that could be used as well of Google Scholar, and there's opportunities as well for new methods of web scraping information in order to have a wider coverage of the research activities. So what this also means is that we might need to not to think just in science, but to try to think of the different types of science and see that different databases might cover different types of science, some science which is more local, some science which is more global, some which is more scientific in its universal scope, other which is closer to application. And I will leave it here for the time being.